welcome to Brain Chat. I'm Dr. Mitzi Joy Williams, your board-certified neurologist and MS specialist, and my mission is to engage, educate, and empower those affected by MS to become an active part of their healthcare team. Here on Brain Chat, we'll be discussing all things MS, health and wellness, advocacy, and we'll even throw a little bit of music and music therapy in there as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next episode. Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of Brain Chat. I'm Dr. Mitzi, the nerdy neurologist, and I'm so excited to be here with you to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that is research. Yay! If you have not logged into Brain Chat before, log into the chat. Let us know where you're viewing from. I bid you greetings from Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm very excited for all of you to be here with us. And I'm even more excited to have our amazing guests. So we're going to hop right into it. We also want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, the National MS Society. And let's get right into this discussion. So I've got an amazing panel for you guys tonight. We have Dr. Annette Okai, who is the Director of Clinical Neuroimmunology and Multiple Sclerosis Research at the North Texas Institute of Neurology and Headache in Plano, Texas. She's also a Clinical Associate Professor of Neurology at Texas Tech University Health Science Center. Dr. Okai, welcome to Brain Chat.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Mitzi. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. And next we have Dr. Leora Freeman, who is the Medical Director of Multiple Sclerosis and Neuroimmunology at Dell Medical School at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Freeman, welcome to Brain Chat.
Hi, Mitzi. Always a joy to see you and see your passion for what you do and wanting to help our patients.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. And last but certainly not least, we have Nana Apong Owusu, who is a graduate of the University of Michigan. She has over 10 years of experience in clinical research as a clinical researcher within the pharma industry. She has a passion for talking about clinical trials within the MS community and was diagnosed with MS in November of 2022. She also has an interest in physical fitness and the health benefits, and we look forward to hearing about her perspective about research today as well. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you, Dr. Williams.
All right. Awesome. 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 So let's talk about one of my favorite topics, which is research. And it's very interesting because I always tell the story about how I actually did not like research. So as a medical student and as a college student, I went to my pre-med advisor and I asked my pre-med advisor as a freshman, could I get into medical school without doing research? That was actually my first question. And they said yes. And I was like, good. Okay, I'm good. Right. And so it's very ironic that now my whole career focuses around research when I was trying to get out of it when I was in college. But let's talk a little bit about your interest in research and how you got involved in conducting research trials, participating in research from your perspective field. So we'll start with you, Dr. Okai, and then we'll go to Nana, and then we'll go to Dr. Freeman.
Well, like you said, Dr. Mitzi, I did not like research either because my exposure to research in undergrad was laboratory and pipettes and, animals.
Centrifuges.
Yes, I said I did not like this. And so, yes, steered away from it as much as I could. But when I did start my residency, ironically, the MS department needed volunteers to work on certain research projects. And somehow I started working on MS research. And it was so fascinating to me. It was a different side of research. I wasn't in a lab doing stuff. I was actually interacting with patients and doing research. And that spurred my passion into for clinical research. And here I am right now talking about it and living it and loving it.
I love it. All right.
And for me, just like you, Dr. Okai, my experience with research also was in a lab in undergrad. organic chemistry labs as well, which I hated.
Oof.
I was pre-med during that time, and as everyone else has said on this call so far, I hated research. I kind of accidentally fell into clinical research through my master's program. I was in my master's program trying to get into medical school, and we had a stint during my epidemiology classes about clinical research, phase development, and research in general, drug development research in general. And that's how I found out about clinical research, and I've been in the field ever since. So now it's been about 13 years.
I love it.
That's awesome. I love hearing your stories. I started in a very research heavy team. So, you all know me. I grew up and trained in France and in a very academic institution. So I really was brought up into research at the same time that I was brought up in the field of neurology. So it was always not so much a question of whether I was going to do research, but what kind of research. And I started in the lab, and I was like, no, I like mice. And so then I fell in the field of neuroimaging. I did my PhD actually in neuroimaging and looking at different type of MRI and molecular technology to understand MS better. And then as I expanded kind of my skills and my understanding of MS, I really fell into the field of outcomes research, looking at the outcomes of people with MS, trying to predict the outcomes of people with MS through multiple lenses, not just the biology of the disease and what we see using neuroimaging data, which still very much interests me, but also taking into account different elements, different factor, biopsychosocial factors to really understand and the trajectory, the journey of people with MS, so that we can have an impact on that journey. And we can inform people who are developing interventions that need to be tested as to what really matters and what might make a difference. So a different journey, but shared passion with all of y'all.
So Leora loved it from the beginning, and everybody else didn't like it, and until we got to deal with some people. So we'll take it. We need somebody in favor of the lab. That we need the lab. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between. So let's first, before we talk about kind of what is the goal of research, what's the difference between bench research and clinical research?
I mean, I think there's different phases, of research. Research is, the way I look at research is, it's not so much separate fields. It's kind of a spectrum. We need bench research. Usually bench research is looking through kind of different technology at the molecular level, at the preclinical animal level, before we can translate into, the human space. And that has a great value. But often what ties it all together, from preclinical to clinical is really the questions we're trying to answer. And so thankfully, we have people who really love bench research and want to get in that space to help us understand the question. And then they really absolutely need us, clinical researchers, to kind of transition, discoveries into the clinical space to really, care for people. So, so that's kind of the difference. It's not so much a difference of questions, but it's a difference of strategies. And sometimes when there are certain things we can better understand when we look at animals like mice, rats, or others, and that we can then translate that discovery and find ways that we can look at the same issue, the same problems in humans, and then develop interventions that can be tested further down the road.
I love that. So it definitely is all tied together, and certainly we do value and need our bench researchers. Even though that wasn't for me, I'm very happy that there are people who get excited about centrifuges and pipettes, and things of that nature, because you're absolutely right. We would not be able to make the clinical advances if we did not have that understanding of things like the pathophysiology of MS, the different molecules that are involved. We have to have all of that tie together. So let's talk a little bit about the different or some different types of research, So I like to stress to people that research is all around us. So when we talk about clinical research, oftentimes people think it is some foreign concept that's kind of over here, but we're doing research on a regular basis. I like to talk about how when I was a kid, we used to do these market research studies. I don't know if anybody ever did those, but I'd be so excited when they would call the house and tell me I could try on 10 different pair of jeans and make $50, if I gave my opinion, because they were doing market research, right? If we're looking for a school for our kids, we research. If we're looking for a hairstylist, if we're looking for a new car, we're always researching, so it is not a foreign concept. It's really a part of our everyday lives, even though we have different answers and different questions that we're trying to address. We're looking at it from the clinical side. So let's talk a little bit about some of the different types of research, clinical trials, and, for instance, let's say registries. So I'll go to you, Nana, since you talked about learning about the phases of research. Tell us a little bit about, what is a clinical trial?
So a clinical trial, as mentioned earlier by Dr. Freeman, we have preclinical trials, which usually involve research within animals. And then we have clinical trials where the research is more so specific to humans. Within those clinical trials, we have 4 different phases, typically phase 1 through 4. Phase 1 through 3, I would say, focus more so on the patients specifically, whereas post phase 3 and phase 4 is more so marketing at that point in time. So what people don't know a lot about clinical trials and the phases is that in phase 1, typically they say that phase 1 studies are involved with healthy human subjects, but depending on the indication, you might not be able to get a human subject that's healthy. So I worked in oncology for many years, and there's never going to be a healthy oncology patient. So phase 1 is just a smaller cohort of patients, and it's usually a dose finding trial in which we're trying to establish a dose as well as determine efficacy of a specific drug or combination of a drug. And then when you get into phase 2 and phase 3, you're opening up the population, in which you're expanding to different populations where there's randomized groups, as well as larger populations.
And what does randomized mean?
Randomization is typically when a study has a subset of patients and they'll say, for instance, we're going to do a placebo versus a specific drug. And patients are randomized usually electronically behind the scenes by a system that's usually called we call it on the research side IVRS, which is Internet Voice System. And it's basically certain patients, whether it's 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 or whatever the pre-specified ratio is, are going to be in the placebo group versus the other group that is going to get on the experimental drug, and nobody knows. So even with that, there are certain trials in which it's double blind and the research population doesn't know who's on what. And then there are certain trials in which maybe the research group knows who's on what specific drug or placebo or what.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Dr. Okai, tell us a little bit about registries. What type of research is that?
So I like to think about registries as real world trials. So what Nana talked about, people are chosen on strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. If you have hypertension, probably you may not be eligible to participate, or diabetes. So registries are, everyone's welcome. So it's real world, and it's for most part patient voices. That's how I like to think about it. Although you have some registries that is a principal investigator inputted, but mostly real world, and it spans across different type of medication. It's really looking for common themes, common goals within a certain cohort. So if we're talking about MS and we're talking about registries, our registries are designed to look at the evolution of the disease or the progression of the disease, and we can include patients on all different medications and not a specific one. We look at trends outside of clinical trials. What have been observed in clinical trial? Does it apply to the real world? So it's a shared community thing, actually. So the population that registry targets is what's happening once we get past the approval in the real world, how things are performing in terms of drugs, and then how the disease manifests in people of all different backgrounds, all different health status. All of that entails, all of that we can get that information from registries.
You know, and you know, as you mentioned, Dr. Okai, when we talk about registries, we talk about real world experience, you know, and one of the things that has been very difficult to capture in our clinical trials has been having inclusive populations, you know, so particularly with MS, most of our clinical trials are conducted primarily in Eastern Europe. We may have smaller US populations. Those populations may not be very diverse. And there's really been a big push, not just in the field of neurology, but I think across all areas of medicine, to try to see how we can increase the diversity in our clinical trials, whether it's people from different parts of the world, people of different ethnic backgrounds, people of different ages. You know, MS has this arbitrary cutoff of 55. Let me be clear that 55 is not old. Okay. I'm saying that because I'm closer to 55 than I am to 25 at this point in my life. So 55 is not old, but for some reason that becomes elderly in our MS trials, right? So we're looking at age, we're looking at levels of ability or levels of disability. And so often we're missing many of the people that we are treating in the real world with our clinical research. So let's talk a little bit about the importance, and I'll, you know, have a round robin and have everybody kind of weigh in on this. What is the importance of making research more inclusive, and maybe what are some of the ways that we can look at approaching this, you know, from a scientific standpoint, from a patient standpoint, from a clinical research organization, you know, standpoint?
No, I'm really glad you bring this. And, you know, I know you've communicated extensively on the issue, and we've researched it and published on it as well. And I know this is something that ties us all together, you know, in the group of people you bring together, is really looking at clinical research as a benefit to not only the community, the scientific community, but the people also who partake in it. And for this, we need research to be more inclusive. It's really interesting how, you know, abysmal the representation of non-white participant has been in MS clinical trial. And this is really something that we need to improve. The way I look at it is that sometimes, you know, we think of inclusivity in research as really benefiting the researcher, the scientific community. If we have more inclusive research, then we're going to be able to generalize research finding more appropriately. And that's absolutely true, right? This is absolutely true that we need more inclusivity in research to have greater generalizability of the research results. But I also like to approach it from the perspective of our patients. You know, that there are benefits to research. There are benefits to being in a research study, and particularly sometimes for people who are medically underserved. They may not be receiving the, you know, really extensive care in their communities. Sometimes being a part of the trial, they can benefit from, you know, more closer follow-up of their disease. Often MRIs are covered as part of the trial that they're part of. They get to be on a medication that's, you know, possibly be on a medication that's not yet approved for their disease, that may be more effective. There are all kinds of benefits for the participants that are valuable. And that's why it's very important for us to think about how do we bring more inclusive populations into our research so that we can share in the benefits of research itself. And, you know, my colleagues can expand on, you know, kind of strategies, but, you know, you mentioned something that really is close to my heart is clinical trial design. Often trials are designed to focus on certain population. We want really, really, really clean population. We want them to be this young, and we want them to have, you know, very, very little in ways of comorbidities and other issues happening besides MS. We want them to, you know, really not have too much in the way of, you know, disability, because we want, you know, essentially we want to optimize showing the treatment effect. But the problem is that the trial population doesn't look like our population. And also sometimes these inclusion and exclusion criteria alienate certain population that will not be able to engage or benefit from this research. So I think that what we can do as a community is really rethink, what are necessary inclusion exclusion criteria? How can we bring in more people by designing our trials differently? What if our trials were not just focused on effectiveness, but also implementation in the real world, and really making that transition from, showing effectiveness of an intervention to implementing it at a broader scale and reducing these disparities. So these are kind of my initial thoughts, but I'd love to hear from my colleagues as well.
So picking up where Leora left off, so she did one part of it. The next part, the next benefit I'd like to talk about when it comes to clinical trial is that if clinical trials are more inclusive and diverse, we can pick up safety signals and efficacy signals early on. So what do I mean by that? So if a clinical trial just have one specific population and the drug comes to real world and we're opening it to everyone, well, certain people of certain ethnicity or certain racial background may have a different response because of the biology of the disease, because of how their underlying biology take that drug, and so we may end up with, wow, this drug may not be as efficacious as it is in this population. So efficacy is something, if we had a diverse population in the first place to begin with, we would have seen those signals. Or let's talk about the safety issues, right? So once again, underlying biology, people are metabolizing something differently, then they may show certain safety issues earlier than waiting until the drug is on the market and say, you know what, and we have to pull this drug off the market because we're seeing this increase in this side effect or something. And so that's the benefit of having an inclusive population with clinical trial. From the patient perspective and lowering the barriers when it comes to that, so Leora talk about clinical trial design. I also like to amplify that to say we should make it less burdensome on the patient, because we want that time, and time is important for these patients, especially if you're medically underserved, if you're financially strapped. So all those social determinants that contribute to healthcare may impact participation in clinical trials. Well, we're in the 21st century. We have lots of COVID has taught us we can do things that people don't have to come to the office for every single blood draw every week. We can do lots of things remotely, so we have to lower the trial burden for patients as well. So, I mean, there are lots of layers to this, and I will turn it over to Nana, who can expand from her perspective. Mute.
I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I think that you both spoke very well on the topic, and there's a couple of points that really speak to me. First and foremost, the whole point of the benefits of inclusion and inclusivity in the clinical trial research, I think is very important, because at the end of the day, we want accurate and true representation of whatever we're researching. And if we're only like focusing on specific populations, it's not true representation for our general population. You can't have, tests on all white subjects and then you have indications that are predominantly high in Black and Brown communities. So that point is very important. But then Dr. Freeman, you also touched on trial design. And I think that that is so important, because as a clinical researcher, even us as monitors on the research side, sometimes we look at a protocol and we're like, why did they think that this was going to work? Or, there's too many visits for the patients, and they don't take that into consideration when the medical writers are building protocols. They don't take into consideration the burden that's on patients. They don't take into consideration the fact that maybe the populations that we really want to research don't have access to the research trials. They don't have the ability to get to a clinic or get to a physician in which they can even talk about or even think about a clinical research trial. So I think that those are two important things that need to be considered in terms of inclusion in clinical trials.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
you
I
bring a very
love.
important.
Go
Oops,
ahead. Go
sorry.
ahead,
I think
Leah.
you bring in a very important point that for me is engagement from our patient's perspective in the clinical trial should not be just when the trial is already designed and
Yes.
packaged by academics
Mhm.
and other people, and in their white tower. It should really be, a co-design process.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I know you've done so much work in this space, Mitzi,
Yeah.
but really
Yeah.
we really need to rethink that,
Absolutely.
and for patients to know that we want more input from them. We want to
Hmm.
engage more with them
Yeah.
upstream of designing trials.
Yeah, so I think, so many nuggets in everything that you said. I mean, we could probably talk a whole nother hour just about this. But I think so many things that you all said are so important. Number one, making sure that people understand that there are benefits to research, right? This is really the cutting edge of medicine. And so, at least making sure that people know it's an option. Even if you don't choose that, people should have access to different options and at least know what their options are. And then when we talk about designing trials, reimagining how we conduct research. I had the fortunate opportunity to participate in a clinical trial where we designed it from the beginning with patient voices, as well as patient advocacy organizations. And it was a very interesting and humbling experience because we as researchers were like, nah, the patients ain't gonna want to do that. And the patients were like, what are you talking about? We don't have a problem with that. And we're like, what? What do you mean? And so again, making sure that that voice is included from the beginning and not just at the end after everything's done. And I think it's the same way when we think about inclusivity, right? Many times people may come and ask for my advice after the protocol is finished, after they've picked all the sites, and then they want me to kind of help increase diversity. I'm like, well, you should have asked me 6 or 7 months ago before
Yeah.
we did all this, And so really being intentional, that is my favorite word when talking about this topic, is that we have to be intentional in the way that we are creating research, in the way that we are outreaching, reaching out to, different communities and making sure that we are really trying to create research that represents the people that these procedures or whatever will serve. Something else I think I want to touch on is let's talk a little bit about the importance of looking at outcomes, for instance, patient reported outcomes. This is something that has, kind of come to the forefront, in recent years. So most of our clinical trials and our research, we're looking at very hard measures. Like, what does the MRI look like? We talk about relapses, we talk about the size of the brain, etc. But now we're really beginning to understand and focus on patient reported outcomes. So it's not just about these hard and fast, measures, but looking at how are people doing on a day-to-day basis? Are they having more trouble? Are they having more fatigue or less fatigue than when they started the trial? So let's talk about the importance of also including the patient voice in the types of outcomes and the types of questions that we're answering.
Well, I can start from the research side. I have noticed that a lot of trials these days do include patient-reported outcomes. It's usually in the form of a tablet. Unfortunately, on the research side, on my side of research anyways, we're not exposed to the questionnaires or the answers that the patients have provided to us in the research scheme of things. But I think it is very important, as you mentioned, because it's not only just moving through a trial and doing what is needed for the research purposes and never hearing anything about it. But I think that if patient reported outcomes are also included in trial design, or even through, from phase 2 to phase 3, there can be tweaks made to research platforms in which the whole research process can be better for not only the patients, but for the outcomes that we receive as researchers in general.
Yeah, so I totally agree. So in our recent trials in MS, we have seen, more PROs, more surveys being put out, more tablet, like Nana mentioned, the tablets and having patient answer the questions, but it still hasn't moved to the forefront of where we want it to be. It's still buried down in a hierarchy, as we call it. So it's still MRI relapses first, and then the patient reported outcomes are at the bottom of that. But at least we have started collecting that and trying to give a patient a voice and see how to do day to day. But so outside of the clinical trials, that's where when we get to phase 4, we do registries and all of that. We can capture some of those outcomes in all the surveys that we do to see how patients are actually doing. But while we have taken a step forward in including them, we haven't really put them high up where their voices are being amplified.
Yeah, I think it's a whole concept. I'm going, from clinician measured efficacy or researcher measured efficacy to personal experience. So our patients live their disease and we measure their disease. And there's a disconnect sometimes between the two. And our clinical measures are sometimes not effective enough. I'm thinking about measuring progression. How do we really Can we really measure progression? When you ask any neurologist who does MS, how do you know a patient's getting worse? Their first answer is probably because they tell me, So in the clinic room, we have that opportunity for this qualitative assessment and talking with patients about what they can do, what they could do last year that they cannot do now. We're able through, this questioning and back and forth and relationship building, we're able to understand the personal experience at a greater degree. But in research, we really want to try to make things more organized, and we have visits and we have outcomes that are measurable and quantifiable, and that's how we're going to show efficacy. And so that's a real challenge that often our clinical measures of the patient experience really lag behind. And so PROs are here to try to bridge that gap, PROs being, surveys where we ask specific questions about specific domains like fatigue or mobility or quality of life experience. And so we're trying to bridge that gap through the PROs, but I don't think that we've invested enough in them to know how they translate exactly to the individual experience and how they can be measurable of the efficacy of an intervention. And then we have an acceptance issue. We tend to like hardcore data, and then the PROs are harder to interpret, and then we tend to put this on the side and not really give them their full value. But when you talk to patients, what matters to them is that day-to-day lived experience with their condition, and that's what we tend to fail to capture.
Yeah. And I think another area, and I mean, this will be for a whole nother show, but another area where we lag behind is in looking at things like lifestyle modification, right? So again, we have many trials that talk about different therapies, the efficacy, safety, etc. But if someone walks into the office and asks me, what's the best diet for MS? I don't really have a whole lot of studies, that I can point to that really give us those recommendations, or what's the best type of exercise, or is there a role for meditation, and so I think that again, as clinical researchers and including that patient voice, we also have to look at some of the questions that we are asking. So all of these questions are important, right? We need to know about efficacy, we need to know about therapies, we want to treat the MS. We ultimately, I tell people my goal is social visits, right? And we talk about the MS for 2 seconds and then you tell me where you went on vacation, right? But until we get there, we also have to think about the other piece. If we're affecting people's day to day, how do we do research, or how do we find ways to get information about lifestyle modification and other things that our patients often are very interested in, and want to hear more about sometimes than some of the other things we want to talk to them about. So, that's an excellent discussion, but I want to go into a little bit more detail for the person who's saying, hey, okay, I hear you guys talking about this clinical trial. I hear you talking about this is important. We need inclusive, what is this process like, right? This thing sounds kind of scary. So let's kind of walk a little bit through the process of being involved in a clinical trial. What does that look like? And let's start with what we call informed consent. So what does that process mean? How does someone educate themselves or find out about what the trial entails and kind of really what they're signing up for?
Okay, so typically, if a patient is even considering or being approached by their physician for participation in a clinical research trial, they're going to have a discussion with their physician. Either their physician thinks that they would be a good candidate for a clinical trial, or sometimes I think it's a very small population, but sometimes there are patients that are advocates for themselves and have looked up a clinical trial, or have heard of it, or someone else in another city. And so they've looked up this trial and they bring it to their attention of their physician and say, hey, how can I get involved in this clinical trial, or where do I have to go? So it usually starts with a discussion with their physician or a group of physicians maybe. And then it comes down to documentation of what we call an informed consent. On the research side, we call it a process. We don't like to just say that it's a one-time thing in which you're signing a form and basically saying, I'm agreeing to be in this trial. But it's a process in which it involves communication, it involves thought process. So when I'm on site and I'm looking at an informed consent form and the process documentation, I'm looking to see if a patient actually had time to think about the trial, discuss the trial with their patient or with their physicians rather, take the consent home to their family and discuss it with their family if there were anything that they needed, just more time to think about. And then the patient usually comes back with the form and discusses it with their physician team further, and then they'll sign it. So the important thing that people kind of look at informed consent as is just an agreement of I'm participating in this trial. But there's a lot of different components to the informed consent. So the main thing is, yes, I am consenting to participation in the trial, but patients have to also know that it's completely voluntary from the very beginning to the end. So at any point in time, you can decide, well, this is not working for me. It doesn't work with my schedule. I just don't want to do it anymore. And so you can pull out at any point in time. But the informed consent documentation also tells you the risks and the benefits of the trial that you're in, the medication that you might be on, the procedures that you might be involved in. So whether it's a lab draw or MRI, all of those things have to be documented in terms of what your burden is and how many times you're going to have to come to the doctor's office, just so that you're aware of that. There are some trials that involve some type of monetary value. And so if that is the case, that has to be included as well in the informed consent process. And then there's just a lot of other different things. But ultimately, the informed consent process just lets the patient know, or the document itself lets the patient know what exactly they're getting into in the trial in general.
Right. And it is, important that people recognize, with informed consent, the doctor or physicians, as you said, Nana, are supposed to go through this with you, right? So you shouldn't go home with 50 pages to read yourself and figure it out. Somebody really should walk you through the document. And I love what you said about it being voluntary, really kind of helping you to understand what you are getting yourself into, so to speak, and what will be the time commitment. Now, you said something about monetary value. I want you to go back and give us a little bit more detail about what that means. Like, are they going to pay me to do the study? I mean, what's up?
Yeah, so some trials do pay patients, and it might be very small, but let's say they have 8 visits on a specific protocol. And there are some studies that I've seen where the patient gets paid a specific amount of money at every visit that they actually complete. And then there's some where you don't get the monetary value until you completed the entire trial successfully. So it just depends on the trial. There are some trials where you're not getting paid for anything. And I think I've touched on this in our last podcast, how the research field has tried to get better with patients, but we call them professional patients, in which they see that there's a monetary value. And then they're saying, well, I'm going to be involved in this trial, and I'm going to be involved in this, and I'm going to go to this city and the next city and just do the same trial. So there's been a lot of honing in on just finding out who's a patient, how many times you may see the same birth date pop up for a specific trial, because it's the same patient going to different sites and just trying to participate. So yes, there is a monetary value a lot of times, but it's not substantial. But I mean, a lot of times it is helpful, even if it's something just like payment for gas or, a cab ride. A lot of times, especially oncology or any type of other chronic illnesses, a lot of times they bake that into the informed consent process just to take that burden off of the patients. I've seen some studies that I've been on in which patients actually travel 3 and 4 hours to come to these visits. And I mean, that's very difficult on not only the patient, but their family members who may have to drive them to the visits. So there is some type of value for that as well.
Absolutely. Anything either of you want to add about the research process?
Yeah, something that I explain to my patients whenever, for me, research is an opportunity. So it's an option, it's a therapeutic option. In some cases, it's an other intervention. But it's an opportunity for them. And what I really try to help them is that the research process doesn't start the moment they enroll. The research process for us has started a long time before, in the design phase, but also in all the compliance steps that are taken to make sure that the research is acceptable and safe. And so I think it's important for us to educate our patients about what comes upstream to that visit where research is offered as an option. And so that people can really understand that there are safeguards in research that try to keep them safe, and that really are, those safeguards are in place, and are in place upstream of that moment in time where kind of research enter their own lives. So I think that that's really important to me, to really explain the research process from the start of, from the idea of this research to the moment where we come, where we're able to have that discussion around informed consent.
Yeah, and I love that you touched on that, because it is important for people to recognize that there are many safeguards in place to make sure that research is conducted ethically. That, even if we give you a survey, we have to run it by somebody to see if giving you that survey is okay. And sometimes we have to, go through a review board process. Sometimes, depending on the information, it may be exempt. But still, everything has to go through a process before we can put a piece of paper in front of you and ask you, anything, as part of the research process. So I'm really glad that you highlighted that, Dr. Freeman. Dr. Okot, you look like you had something to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to once again pull from what Nana said, that, it's a process. It's not a one-time thing. So even if there's a tweak to the protocol, like we need to do an extra blood draw just this one time, we come back to you and say, well, do you have to, could you please sign this form to say you are agreeing to that? So every little change is brought back to the patient for your consent to do that. Another thing I wanted to point out, that if for whatever reason this isn't working for you, you can withdraw the consent anytime. And also, if your principal investigator sees that probably this isn't the right study for you, or things aren't going as it should, that you can also be withdrawn for your safety. So, and then there are lots of monitoring. We who conduct clinical trials, we have people, the monitors come in every quarter to look at all our charts to make sure we're doing things ethically, and patient safety is the primary goal. So those guardrails, like Dr. Prima mentioned, are in place to make sure that patients are treated well. No mistreatment is occurring, no from the side of the investigator, the sponsor, and then the overall oversight that goes with clinical trial is so rigid and rigorous that in this time, in this space where we are conducting research, we are doing it well. We have to give ourselves that pat on the back to say we've learned from the past, and we are not going back to doing mistreatment like we had in the past. We are doing a good job of keeping patients safe.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to recognize is that, once the trial is over, the research doesn't necessarily stop, right? Sometimes people are monitored in what we call extension phases, but also once a medication or therapy comes to market, if there are issues that arise when we get it out in the general population, those things are reported back, right? So it's not like we just say, okay, clinical trial is done, just go out and be free and we'll never monitor anybody again. And whatever happens, nobody will know about it. So I think it's important to recognize that, again, it's a process and it is ongoing. After that medication is approved, after that procedure or therapy is approved, they're still monitoring so that if there are new issues that arise, there are constantly, things being changed and the label, and your doctor is constantly being informed that, okay, we saw this new side effect, and we need to address this accordingly. So what questions should people be asking, if they want to be involved in research? Are there questions that they should ask their doctor, or things they should, make sure they address when they are trying to or considering participating in the research process?
I think we alluded to some of them in the last section, but once again, is this right for me? What are the benefits, the side effects associated with the treatment that I'm going to be on in this clinical trial? And the informed consent is written, and it's actually federal. You have to write it at a level, at a eighth grade level, so that lay people can understand it, and it's all not scientific jargon, as we call it. So what the potential side effects that could occur. What is the time commitment that I have to give to this trial? How am I going to be monitored? What if something happened? What if I want to withdraw my consent? So, those are some of the questions that the potential subject can ask the investigator or the clinical staff when it comes to that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Annette. What I wanted to add is, as I said earlier, research is an option. So I encourage patients to ask, what are my other options if I don't partake in this research?
Mm-hmm.
What are my other options? What else could I be doing? So that you can define, really what you're more comfortable with.
And I would add just the time commitment that's involved, because it's not so easy. And sometimes research trials are just a matter of doing some procedures that are already being done during a normal visit. But oftentimes patients do have to come back. So in order for the research to be accurate and patients to be compliant and us receive accurate outcomes, patients have to be committed and be compliant in their participation with all of their procedures, as well as their attendance at their visits.
Yeah. I love it. Well, listen, our time is up. This has been an amazing discussion that I think will be very informative about the research process. I think, again, the goal is to educate and to know your options, right? At the end of the day, clinical trials may not be for everyone, but I do think my personal opinion is that everybody can be involved in research in some way, whether it's a clinical trial, whether it's a survey, whether it's trying on those jeans like I did, whatever, exercise studies. They're all different types of research that are going on, and your voice matters. And I think that people should recognize that it really is a matter of standing up and being counted, right? Because your voice is important to help us not just to serve, particular communities with MS, but to help us to better serve everybody that lives with MS. Are there any parting thoughts from each of you about, getting involved in research?
Research is a partnership. This is where we all come together. This is my message. This is where, of course, we come together in the clinic room with the individual patient, but research is where we come together as a community, where participants, doctors, researchers, and hopefully more and more advocacy groups and patient experts kind of really come in together to lead to a vision, that we all have to cure MS eventually. So I think for me, this is being part of the community.
I like to say it is being part of the community, but research is also, yes, being part of the community, but also having access to the latest cutting edge technology that we have out there, and being more having you have more contact with your doctor, and in a way the process itself educates you about the disease and what you can expect or what to look out for, so that enhances the experience and also help you through your journey of whatever disease process you're going through.
And I'll just add that research is safe. Over the years, we know that people are very hesitant to engage in or even participate in research trials because they're scared of, as history repeating itself, or scared of what's going to happen to them on this specific trial. Oftentimes, they consider research trials to be, I don't want to be a guinea pig. It's always, I don't want to be a guinea pig, but you're not going to be the guinea pig. And on top of that, as Dr. Okai mentioned earlier, there's so many safeguards that are in place. So research is very safe. And I think that people should just, participate.
Awesome. Well, listen, this has been amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Okai. Thank you so much, Nana. Thank you so much, Dr. Freeman, for your insight, for your wisdom. I know that our Brain Chat audience is going to get so much out of this. And to our Brain Chat audience, thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this episode. We will see you again in 2 weeks. Don't forget to go and subscribe to Brain Chat with the Nerdy Neurologist on all podcast platforms. Have a great week, everybody.